Welcome to CompTIA Private Limited, e-learning program of hardware networking. We are going to discuss about storage technologies, magnetic storage. In that, we'll discuss about floppy disk drive, floppy disk and floppy drives. So, data storage is very important in the computer, right? So, the processor, memory are all the components which is helping you for processing the data and storing the data temporarily in the memory. But for future reference, you need to have a kind of a storage area. Hard disk is another storage medium, which we are going to discuss in a separate topic. Here, this is for the floppy disk. So, once in a time, right? So, when the computers are introduced, the entire operating system called DOS, disk operating system, it was stored in the floppy drive only. So, what people used to do in that days, they boot the system with the floppy drive, the DOS operating system. They'll remove the floppy disk and they'll work on some of the informations, coding or programming, whatever it is. Then they will save the program. They'll remove the data hard disk and data floppy drive and insert the OS disk again. They'll go for shutting down, and then whenever they start, they use the floppy disk for starting the system. Boot disk, we call it as a boot disk. So that is in case of DOS, but now we have got a lot of operating system, and we need to go for a hard disk drive for storing the huge amount of data, and the technology has got improved. So we had floppy disk and drives some time back, but I don't think we are getting the floppy drive in the latest computer, desktop or laptops. Even in some of the laptops, I'm not seeing CD drive itself. That itself is provided as an external drive. So to make your laptop compact and thin in shape, so what people are doing, so they brought out the CD drive, and we need to use it as an external drive only. If at all you want to read any content from CD or DVD, you will have an external DVD drive or CD drive. You can use it from outside. So that is how they made the hardware as compact in case of laptop, and it is same for desktops also. So floppy is not available, but you can see the controllers are provided with along with the IDE controller. So you'll have both floppy drive controller and hard drive controller. So data is stored in those days. So the size is very low in size, like 1.44 MB is a nominal size what we used it. We had lower capacity as well as higher capacity, but mostly we used 1.44 MB capacity for one floppy disk. And the entire operating system like Novel or Windows NT, we used to install using the floppy disk. 14 floppy disks we'll be having, so we'll be inserting one by one so that the entire operating system is getting installed in the hard drive. So then instead of CD, right, we had the operating system from floppies. So those kind of usage we had it. So important data, confidential data, how to transport from one place to other place, they used a floppy disk. So that was a easy medium to transport the data. Now it is changed, right? So you have a pen drive, it is having a capacity of 64 GB or 128 GB. You cannot believe more than a hard disk capacity we are having now. The same way hard disk capacity increased to 1 terabyte. So the technology is growing, so we cannot do anything on that. So now we'll let understand how the floppy drive was functioning, and what are all the issues we had, and how the people have provided the support for the floppy disk issues, and the importance of floppy drive. So we'll discuss in this topic. So probably we had a interface like ID interface and a SCSI interface for connecting. Both the things are connected for hard disk drive. SCSI is mainly used in the server platform. So normally in the desktop environment, we used EIDE or IDE environment for connecting the floppies and DVDs as well as the hard disk. So this is how the floppy drive is looking like. Earlier we had a separate controller for floppy drive, so we have to insert inside the ISA slot, that is the slot used in the motherboard. So we'll be inserting a slot separate IO card and connect the floppy drive into that card. Later point in time, they introduce as a combined drive for both hard disk and floppy drive as IDE controller, and that is also integrated with the motherboard, not available as a separate card. So we'll get 34 pin connector in the motherboard, so that will be used for connecting the floppy drive. So then floppy drive and hard drive will be mounted in the chassis of the motherboard, chassis of the CPU box. So the important component in the floppy disk drive is the read-write heads. So that is responsible for reading your data from the floppy disk. So floppy disk is made up of magnetic material. We'll come to know. So about floppy disk, we'll get more details in the coming slides. Now, this read-write head is responsible for reading and writing the data from the floppy disk. So that is a magnetic material. So from that, you'll have tracks and sectors, and based on the information available, it will be read from the read-write head. So you have multiple component like head motor, head flat cables, headset, write protect switch, disk presence switch, activity LED, whether it is working or not, eject button. Once you press this button, the floppy will be pushed out, and spindle motor for rotating your floppy disk, disk type switch, head movement screw. So the head will be moving in and out for reading. This is the assembly for having the head, and the floppy disk will be rotating using the spindle motor. Here the head is available. It will move from the first track to the last track. So disk opener, right? So head actuator for a floppy disk drive is what moves the head across the disk. So you will have multiple tracks, right, in a circle one. So the head has to move the position from first track to the last track so that it can read the information from the magnetic disk. Okay, and that is called head actuator. Spindle motor. So this is a very important motor. This is going to rotate the disk, and it is going to help to read the data from the disk. So it will be rotating in a uniform speed and helping to reach out the particular track. Then the head will move to that particular track and read the content. So it will rotate at 300 to 360 rpm depending on the type of drive we have. So you'll have a circuit board. So that will have controller circuits for controlling the operations of a floppy drive. Track zero sensor. So whether it's a floppy disk or a hard disk, you have a track zero available because this magnetic media stores the data in the form of tracks. A circle, right? Multiple circles will be available from 0 to n numbers you'll have. So we need to find out the track zero. The importance of track zero is uh, it will be having a critical informations in track zero. So we need to find out from where this track zero, and we'll have to start reading the content from the track zero one. Write protect switch. So sometimes, right, in the floppy disk, we will have a critical data in the floppy disk. For example, we can take my floppy disk has a operating system, so nobody should modify the content, right? Either delete it or overwrite it. So wrongly they can overwrite. So what we can do, we'll be having a write protect switch. So I will enable the option in the floppy disk. So if I enable it in the floppy disk, so by mistake also nobody can write the data, right? Nobody can modify the data. So that is one thing. And suppose I have critical business critical files, and it has to be updated only by the senior people, not by everybody. So I'll have the write protect enabled in the floppy disk, so people cannot write the data into it. But it is not a big thing. It is only a slider, right? So once you move the slider button, so it will enable the write. So what we are going to say here is this switch will make you to understand that this floppy is critical and you should not overwrite the data. Okay, so that is the reason for having a write protect switch. Power supply connector, you have a SMPS power supply connector available, and you'll be connecting a 4-pin wire. So you have plus 5 plus 12, then ground signals for the particular thing. You had a floppy drive for 5 5/4 inch and 3.5 inch. So based on that, you'll be using a size of the power supply connector. Floppy drive cable, it is a gray color cable, and one side it will be having a kind of purple or light violet in color, so that indicates that's a starting wire, the first wire of a cable. And you could see a twist in the cable, right? That is intentionally made it for floppy disk drives, connecting the drives. So whenever I have two disk, right? So in case of hard disk, we have master slave configurations. I can decide which is master, which is slave. Likewise, if I am connecting two floppy disk drive, so I need to decide which one is going to be drive A and which one is going to be drive B. So in that case, which will decide the drive option is the cable. So if you connect it after the twist, which is drive A, in the middle of the floppy drive, it is drive B. So that is how we created the understanding. So if you log into the system, you will see the drive letters accordingly. So always drive A and B is reserved for floppy disks. From C to Z, it is given for a hard disk drive. And if at all you connect CD drive, it will take the next letter from the CD. I mean hard disk. Suppose the hard disk has got CDE, immediately the next drive letter will be F. And in Windows, you had the option to change the drive letter. You can keep any drive letter. You can keep it as a Z drive or anything. In other way, people create a shared drive, and they'll mark it as a local drive, right? So they'll give a drive letter like some other drive letter they will use. So if I log into that drive letter, I can see the shared folders from other drives. That is the case of drive letters. So in motherboard, you can find out a 34-pin connector. You can see a small cut available. In the same way, you'll have some small projection in the connector. So this will help you to connect the cable in a correct direction. So anyway, the pins are provided like that, so you cannot insert it. But some people will apply force and connect the connectors, right? So we should avoid it. So if you see the cut and insert it properly, you will not have problem of wrong connection. Types of floppy drive. So we had three different size: 5/4 inch, 3.5 inch, right, and 8 inch. So most probably we have seen 3.5 inch floppy drive only because it is small and the latest technology it is, and the size varied from 1.2 MB to 1.44 MB. In the latest floppy drive called zip drive, it was having 2.88 MB. So any floppy drive created in the industry, that was having maximum of 2.88 MB size. But generally we used 1.44 MB file only. So 2.88 is a different drive. We cannot use a normal floppy drive. We have to use a zip drive. So that is a different technology. So we used to have 1.44 MB floppies. We buy 10 floppies and used for carrying the data, copying the data, and storing it for a long-term use, and keeping the operating system, keeping the critical files. So all those things we have done with the floppy disk. So disk changing. So in order to understand that the existing disk is removed and I have inserted a new disk, we have a disk changing sensor. This is to avoid or enable reading the disk drive from the beginning. So once a disk is inserted, the floppy drive will keep the details in the FAT table or the remembrance it will have. So if I'm not going to have this sensor, what will happen? Even if I'm going to insert a new floppy disk, if I see the content, right, if I put the DAR command, I'll see only the old data because it is there in the memory and fat content. So you'll be seeing the old data only. That's the reason they inserted a concept called the disk change sensor. So once you remove the disk and insert a new disk, the disk change sensor will intimate to the controller that a floppy disk has been removed. Okay, maybe you are inserting the same disk, then also it will assume that existing disk was removed and new disk is getting inserted. So I need to read it from the beginning. So it will start reading the entire content and keep it ready for easy access. Okay, so disk change sensor is used for notifying that the disk has been removed, a new disk has been inserted into the floppy drive, and read the content from the beginning. Okay, that is disk change sensor. So floppy disk, it is thin, very thin. and used for carrying the data with limited size. You cannot compare it with the mobility of devices what we have now with the devices we had in 20 years back. So anyway, as part of learning, we should learn about the mediums available for transportation of data between different places. The size of the floppy disk is 3.5 inch. It will be fitting in the floppy drive. You have a hole indicating that high capacity disk. So we had earlier capacity, so which is low capacity 1.2 TB. With the same 3.5 inch, we had a 1.2 TB. So to indicate that it is 1.44, you have a small hole. So that will intimate the floppy drive that it is with high capacity. Second one, the hub that engages with the drive motor. So that is to hold the disk into the motor. Third is a shutter that protects the surface when removed from the drive. So it will be like a open close option. When you insert, the shutter is automatically getting open and the media is getting exposed. So, and if I remove it from the drive, the shutter will automatically close. You're seeing the blue color cut, right, in the number 3. So if I push it on the left towards left, it will be exposing the medium, the magnetic film. It will be a magnetic film, thick film, right? So to protect it from the outside environment, like you have moisture or dust, or sometimes we may create scratches by using pens or any other medium. So to avoid all those damages, we have a shutter available. So that is going to help you for protecting the media. Fourth one is a plastic housing. So to the safeguard the entire disk, you have a plastic housing. Fifth one is the polyester sheet. So inside the floppy drive, you'll have sheets with the plastic one. So even if it is touching the plastic body, it will not create any damage to the medium. Sixth is the magnetic coated plastic disc. So you have a magnetic coating over it. So you should not keep it near any other electronic devices, right? You have a floppy disk. If you are keeping near the CRT monitor or near any other heat related microwave or near the gas, what happens is, right, it is a magnetic property. Because of this kind of interactions with other devices, it may lose the data, right? Film will not go damaged, right? But the magnetic property will go damaged, and you'll be losing the data. If you insert it, you cannot read the data from the particular disk. So when you are handling the floppy disk, normally people keep it in packets, right? So that is also not suggested. So we'll have to keep it in a box and keep it in a bag, and keep away from the electronic devices contacts, electrical and electronics. So it may crash your data available in the floppy disk. So we should be very careful in handling the floppy disk. So magnetic coated plastic disk. Seventh one is schematic representation of one sector of data on the disk. So this is how we call it as a sector. So you are seeing the circular lines, right? Continuously you are seeing the continuous circular lines. That is a tracks. Track 1, track 2, track 3, like that. And they are cutting the track into a small portion that is called as a sector. It may be having same kind of size. Maybe the internal track has 512 bytes, and same will be having in the same outside track. So later point in time, they wanted to shrink it and store more data, because I want to make the sector size equal. If you see here, inside sector is small and then outside sector is bigger, right? So but the capacity of the data stored in the sector is same. So if I can store, for example, I'm saying 512 bytes of data in the internal sector. If I take the same size for the outer sector, what will happen? So I can cut it as a 3, right? and 3 into 512. So with the same disk, I can store huge amount of data. So that technology was thought process and implemented later point in time, but not for the floppy disk, right? So they made the compression and started dumping more amount of data in the hard disk and all. So we'll discuss more in the hard disk session. Eighth is the write protection tab in upper left. So that is the one. So you move it up and it will get write protected, and you will not be able to write any data into it. So that is the tabs. So types of floppy disk. So you had 80 inches, 8 inches of floppy disk, which is of 200 millimeter diameter, and then you got 5.25 inch, which is 133 millimeter. Later, we had a 3.5 inch, which is 90 millimeter floppy that was stayed for a long time and used in the many places. So we used to carry games via the floppy disk. So transfer from one system to other system. So there are a lot of usage we had it with the floppy disk, because those days we don't have CDs also. So only way to mobilize the data from one place to other place, we use floppy drives. So those days we don't have modem that much flexibility not available in buying the modem and using the telephone lines. If at all I have a telephone line and internet, I'll get internet speed with kbps. Okay, so it will be very less in speed, and for transferring 1 MB data, I'll have to keep my network connection connected for 4 hours or 5 hours. Now whatever speed I have, right, 100 Mbps in my home, so I'll download 1 GB of data in 10 minutes of time. So that is how the internet has grown and the technology has changed. Okay, so types of floppy disk, there are only three types. Floppy disk drive facts. So some of the general informations about the floppy disk drive. So what they're saying, if I'm going to keep multiple floppies together, two or more floppies together, it will not create any magnetic impact. Just now I said, if we keep it near the electromagnetic devices or electrical devices, the magnetic field in the floppy disk will get damaged and you will be losing the data. But that is not the case for having multiple floppies together. So in a box you will have 10 floppies, maybe used one and unused one, but the magnetic field will not get spoiled because of multiple floppy disk. Whereas if I have a magnet speaker, right, I have a speakers available, so if I keep over the speaker one of the floppy disk for half an hour or 15 minutes also, when if I use it next time, right, I cannot read the data, because of the magnetic clash, right, the data would have been erased. So it has reduced the magnetic capacity, and you cannot read the data from the floppy disk. Okay, and to identify the floppy drive A and B, you're just using the twist in the floppy disk cable. And the other one is, like other household appliances, floppy disk also cannot be repaired, floppy disk drive, because the cost of repairing the drive is higher compared to buying a new floppy drive. So if at all anything goes wrong, we'll suggest for replacing the floppy drive. Okay, there are service centers which can rectify the issues, but if the cost is more, then you can suggest to go for buying the new floppy drive, but this is not required at this point in time. Nobody is going to use it. So in the corner of every 3.5 inch, you have a small slider. Just now we discussed, right, parts of floppy disk. So if you make it as uncovered and the holes is available, then the data is write protected. If it is in the downside, if you are not seeing the hole, it is unprotected. So for safeguarding the data inside the floppy disk, we are using this option. So we used a floppy disk later point in time for recovering the system. Say my system is crashed and I need to have a recovery disk, operating system recovery disk. So I will have the recovery information stored in my floppy. I used to do it frequently, like monthly once. I have critical service in my network, so what I will do, I'll take the recovery files in my floppy disk. So if anything goes wrong, more than taking in the data from the backup tapes and the drives, right, it is taking more time. So I'll use the floppy disk recovery disk, and it will help me to recover the operating system, and I can immediately go for working with the operating system, right, and get back the data. So that is used as a recovery disk. Okay, in other case, a machine is affected with a virus, and you want to do a remedial steps for cleaning the virus, right? So you'll be booting the system with clean boot disk in the floppy drive, and you'll try to kill the virus by running the program, antivirus program. Otherwise, also for recovery options, we use the floppy disk for cleaning the system. So bootable diskettes are used for updating the BIOS on a personal computer. So how to update the BIOS firmware? So I'll have the software in the floppies. Once the system is booted from floppy, then I'll just install the programs from floppy to the BIOS. For high density purpose, we used zip drives, but that is not also available now. Bad floppy diskettes. So if you are not handle it properly, the magnetic property of the floppy disk will go off. Then no point in having the data. Just throw the floppy disk. That's it. You cannot reuse it or reconsume it, right? You cannot create a magnetic field again and push it in the floppy disk. That is not possible, right? So you'll have to buy the new floppy disk and use it. And if you are continuously using for reading and writing also, wear and tear, even though if you are keeping it safeguarded in a box kind of setup, so if you do it for multiple read and write, overwriting the data, the magnetic property will come down. So these are all degrading things, right? You have 100% capacity in the fresh condition. So as you read and use the floppy disk, the lifetime of the magnetic signals will come down, and one time you will not be able to read any data from the magnetic disk, floppy disk. That is natural, so you cannot do anything. We don't have option to improve or increase the magnetic field in the floppy disk tapes, floppy disks. So we'll just throw the floppy disk, and we used to keep multiple copies so that even if one goes bad, I can use the other one. I don't get any alert that the floppy disk is getting old, so take a copy like that. Like we are getting the alert in printer toner, like it is 30% low. Order for a new toner so that you get avoid the printing issues, something like that, right? So I cannot get any error messages from the floppy drive controller that your floppy is losing its life. Try to copy the data into new floppy drive. So I used to have multiple copies so that I can safeguard my data. Those days we don't have internet also, right, where I can upload my data in the drives, OneDrive or Google Drive, and anytime I can restore it from online. That is not possible, right? Not set up in BIOS. So if you are not setting up the floppy drive properly, maybe you have a 3.5-inch floppy drive with 1.44 MB capacity, reading capacity, but you set the floppy drive as 3.5 MB, 3.5 inch size, but 1.2 MB, then it is a conflict, right, with the hardware and the physical drive. There will not be any proper communication, so that has to be avoided. While setting up the BIOS, you can change the setting. In eliminating the possible conflicts with other hardware, so if at all somebody is changed the IRQ in the BIOS, you can do all these things, right? So if somebody is changing the IRQ for a floppy drive, then definitely it will malfunction. In the computer, the IRQ is interrupt request. It is being fixed. So all the hardwares are given a standard IRQs. So we'll have to follow it. Unknowingly, I'm assigning the IRQ both common for hard disk and floppy disk. Definitely, both the things will not work because there is a conflict between the IRQ devices. So we should not do like that. So not connected properly. If the power cable is not connected, data cable is not connected, definitely you will not be able to read the data from the floppy disk. So immediately you'll have to disassemble it and then assemble it back and see whether you are able to see it. You will get the green color light if everything is working fine and the reading of floppy disk is also good. So general troubleshooting on floppy disk. So invalid media track zero bad. Try formatting another floppy disk. So if you are getting the message as track zero bad, then no other point in using the disk. You have to throw the disk. So because track zero is very important for floppy disk as well as hard disk. Write protect error, because the disk is write protected by using the slider, and it is intentionally made, right? Sometimes unknowingly also it is available. So you can, if you are sure that the disk is not the operating system disk or not the critical disk having critical data, then you can release the protected sensor, and you can go ahead with writing the data. If you are sure, then you can do it. Otherwise, don't do it. Invalid drive specifications. Sometimes we assign different drive. It will create a conflict. We should configure the BIOS properly in floppy drive section. So it should be with A and B. So we cannot assign A and B to the hard disk and C and D to the floppy drives. That is not possible. So we made it as a condition. So it has to be aligned like that. Bad hardware. So if at all you are getting this kind of error, or you see the controllers are not working properly, even though after reassembling multiple times the reading and writing is not happening, you checked with the new cable, and it is also not recognizing. Probably you can test it with any other system for once, whether it is reading it properly or not. Otherwise, better to change the floppy drive controller, floppy drive itself, so that you can get rid of this problem. Because sometimes, right, servicing or repairing the floppy drive controller is cheaper than sorry, buying the new floppy drive controller is cheaper than doing the servicing of floppy drive, right? So probably people are not preferred for servicing a floppy drive, they preferred for buying the new floppy drives. So this is about the floppy disk drive, and we have come to the end of the topic. So this is for knowledge purpose, and you should know about the floppy disk what we had it earlier. And if at all you go to some of the office, if they have old systems, you could find the floppy drive, but it is very rare that you get floppy disk in the market. So just keep this as for your reference and for knowledge purpose. Thank you very much.